Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read for 6 books. Here Goes Nothing, the latest novel by Steve Toltz, an Australian writer. Kang, Greek Lessons, her new novel came out recently. This was translated by, I think her name is Denise Smith. Deborah Smith, sorry, who is her regular translator. Javier Marias, A Heart So White, translated by Margaret Hull Costa. This was a buddy read with Roz over at Scully Dangling About the Books. Kurt Vonnegut's final novel, Timequake. Argentinian author Daniel Guebel, The Jewish Son, translated by Jessica Sequeira. And finally Joshua Cohen, Moving Kings. So I'm going to start with the Toltz. This is his third novel. His other two were Quicksand and A Fraction of the Whole, and this is very much in his style, but I actually think the most successful of the three. So Toltz's style is a mixture of sort of metaphysical observations and humour, almost a laugh on every page. And before I say why I think it's more successful than his other two, I'll just give you an idea of his humour. I suspect I might be dating Buddhists. All the men I'm going out with are really into non-attachment. In some cultures, widows shave their heads or are buried with their husbands. They're expected to howl like tornadoes or wear black forever or marry their brother-in-law. Here, they're expected to drink cups of milky tea and have a lie down. And finally, she gave off the vibe of a librarian who'd just come back from a book burning. So that's the sort of the level of humour. There's sort of witty lines like that, pretty much, as I say, on every page. So this is about a guy who, like most of Toltz's main protagonists, is a bit of a wastrel, doesn't really have his life together, but has had the good fortune to meet a wonderful woman called Grace, and they get married. And Grace is a fabulous character. She delivers, I suppose, are they sermons or speeches at weddings? But she's very alternative. She's very sort of by the knuckle as to the reality of married life and the challenges. You know, she points up all the negative stuff really, and personalises it to the people who commission her to give these speeches. And her husband, he records them, he videos them. They sort of work together. And she is heavily pregnant when the doorbell rings, and this guy who she's never met before turns up and sort of says, look, I'm awfully sorry to trouble you, but I have an incurable brain condition. I'm going to die within 3 months, and this is the house that I grew up in, and I would like to die here. And so he sort of wheedles his way in. A lot of that is untrue, although he does have an incurable brain disease, and he does have limited time left on Earth. But he has far darker ulterior purposes. And her husband, who's not particularly happy about the situation, obviously, he winds up dead. And this book is split into alternating chapters between the husband finding his way around in the afterlife and the other two back on Earth, in the land of the living. And the afterlife is very much like life on Earth. You just have all the same sort of facilities and functions, but people are just a bit more down in the dumps because they realise they've been rent apart from the people who love them and who they love. But he manages to sort of find, through a sort of a technology which is essentially like sensory deprivation tanks, a way of revisiting his wife and effectively haunting her. Not in a scary way, and she's aware of him, but they can't communicate. He has no ability to, to leave messages or move things about or speak. The guy with the brain condition eventually dies. He also ends up in the afterlife and also discovers a way of returning to haunt her. So it's a bit of a sort of a ménage à trois. Only two of the three are ghosts. And it makes a lot of, as I say, metaphysical reflections on life, existence, obviously marriage, birth, death, religion, and I think it makes some very good points. the background going on all the time is that there is a new pandemic, not COVID, but another thing, and it's far more virulent, and the afterlife can't cope with the new arrivals. So that's also going on, the pressure in the afterlife. I just thought it was a very good read. It's a quick read, you know, it's a reasonably sized book, but very enjoyable, 5 stars. And on to Han Kang's book, Greek Lessons. Han Kang is just a writer of beautiful filigree work. So there are 2 characters here, both Korean. A guy who teaches ancient Greek language, who grew up in Germany, but has returned to Korea because he has a debilitating eye condition, that he will probably lose his sight. And the other main character is a pupil of his, who was a very precocious child, taught herself language, taught herself to write the pictographic or the character-based Korean alphabet. Well, it's not an alphabet, is it? At a very young age, and was very gifted with words. And then she had something happen to her, which is never really revealed in the book, whereby she stopped speaking and she stopped writing. And obviously her parents were very worried about this and took her to a psychiatrist, and nothing was working. But the psychiatrist said she has to be social, she has to be in a social environment to bring her out of herself, to encourage her to speak. So that she's sent to a school where she's obviously bullied because, you know, she's sort of effectively mute. But she responds in a French class because it's such an alien language to the one that she grew up with, being Korean. And she recovers because she sort of gloms on to sort of learning French, and that sort of revivifies her ability to speak and write again. But when the book opens, she's lost the ability again as an adult because she's had 2 body blows. Her mother has died, and then she's been deemed an unfit mother and had her son taken away by her father, by her husband. They're separated. And in a way, it reminded me of The Vegetarian, that, you know, the fact that she's punished as a woman because of the status of the husband, but also that whole thing about, you know, we don't know what caused her to stop talking, but it's like, in a way, it's the sort of declarative decision in The Vegetarian to become a vegetarian, flying full in the face of that, you know, that is going to be deemed as disrespectful and antisocial by her family. In a way, the character here was in a similar position with regard to her family. They sent her to a psychiatrist because she's not right, but it's very much because she's a woman in this sort of cultural milieu. So gradually the book alternates between the 2 characters, and then gradually they're going to come, you know, she attends his classes, but of course she doesn't communicate and speak in any way. It makes a lot of very interesting points about language. You know, he's a, as I say, a teacher of ancient Greek, but he's keen to delve into the ideas of Plato and the Greek historians and philosophers. She's not interested in that. She's only interested in language qua language, as an alien, strange tongue that, again, might break her out of her silence. So she's not interested in the ideas that he is trying to communicate. It makes a very interesting point, I think, about how Greek and Latin were languages of ideas, to communicate ideas of reason and logic and dialectics and rhetoric. It was very much sort of tailored with these sort of discursive, argumentative conversations, and rather than the language of emotions. And of course she needs a language of emotion to be able to express exactly what is troubling her so. Unlike before, the silence that has now returned after a period of 20 years is neither warm, nor dense, nor bright. If that original silence had been similar to that which exists before birth, this new silence is more like that which follows death. Whereas in the past she had been submerged under water, staring up at the glimmering world above, she now seems to have become a shadow, riding on the cold, hard surface of walls and bare ground, an outside observer of a life contained in an enormous water tank. She can hear and read every single word, but her lips won't crack open to emit sound. Like a shadow bereft of physical form, like the hollow interior of a dead tree, like that dark, blank interstitial space between one metre and another, it is a bitter, thin silence. 20 years ago she had failed to predict that an unfamiliar language, one with little or no resemblance to her mother tongue, would break her own silence. She has chosen to learn ancient Greek at this private academy because she wants to reclaim language of her own volition. She is almost entirely uninterested in the literature of Homer, Plato and Herodotus, or the literature of the later period written in Demotic Greek, which her fellow students wish to read in the original. Had a lecture course been offered in Burmese or Sanskrit, languages that use even more unfamiliar script, she would have chosen them instead. It's just a delightful, delicious, subtle read. You know, I've given you what the plot is, I suppose, but it's a very slight plot. It's a teacher and a student. They don't really communicate until they sort of come together by an event at the end. It's not a romantic coming together in any way. It's about communication. He's losing his eyes or his sight, and you know, she writes on his hand with her finger. She does Korean characters on his finger. So it's a very unusual, you know, piece of writing. If you were summing up, it seems very slight, but it isn't because of the quality of the writing. 5 stars. And on to Javier Marias, Heart So White. This is my second Marias book this year. Stylistically very similar to the other one I read, which was The Infatuations, that he's very discursive, very digressive, very long sentences in long blocks of paragraphs. The interesting thing is that here the sections, they start off with one thing and they lead in through another, and then by the end of it, after that, that hasn't taken very long within the chapter, then you get into the meat of what he really wants to talk about in that chapter, and you think, how did I get to here from how this chapter started? But it works. It really works. The opening scene is just tremendous. So there's a dinner party after a couple have come back from their honeymoon. They're at their parents' at this dinner party. The newlywed bride goes off into the bathroom, puts a gun to her breast and commits suicide, which is obviously very, very shocking. Not only that, but the scene is so brilliant because of, you know, everyone is sort of piling into the bathroom to see what's happened. It's a bit like that scene in the Marx Brothers film, I can't remember which one it is, where they're stowaways on a cruise liner and just all these characters pile into a cabin. And it's a hilarious scene. I do recommend you check it out. But also it has the choreography of Kafka's opening scene in America, which is the trial of a stoker on board a passenger ship. So quite similar in a way to the Marx Brothers. The choreography, whereby you get all these characters sort of piling in one after the other in a way that sort of defies physics, but it's beautifully rendered. And the other thing about the first chapter is there was a maid who was serving the dinner, and she doesn't know what's gone on in the bathroom. She's seen that, you know, the whole dining room is vacated, that the wine is still in the glasses, so she doesn't know what's gone on. So she's narrating sort of what she needs to be doing as part of her maid's job. In you know, what do I do? Do I take the plates away? Do I take the wine glasses? Do I refill them? All this sort of stuff. And it very much reminded me of a hilarious scene in Samuel R. Delaney's book Babel 17, where there's this sort of dinner party with automated robots serving, and then a sort of huge laser gunfight breaks out, and these robots, of course, being non-conscious, are just carrying on trying to do their automated functions. A very bizarre sort of juxtaposition of Kafka and a Samuel R. Delaney, a science fiction writer. But anyway, so the main, that's the opening chapter, and I think works really well to set the book up. And it's a quite a meandering journey as to take us back to, you know, what are the reasons? Why did the young bride do that? And that is sort of revealed at the end. And I have to say, in a way, the plot is less engaging than some of the ideas and discussions that get us there. I think the plot is a bit pedestrian in that way, and the reveal is a bit pedestrian. But it didn't matter, because the journey was what was so fascinating. Is Maria's protagonist, who is, so the young bride who shot herself, her husband marries her younger sister and has a child who is called Juan, who is the narrator of this book, and he too is newly married to a woman called Louisa. And it's a book about relationships and marriage and love. So, for example, it talks brilliantly, I think, about how when two individuals who've been leading individual lives in their individual houses or flats, whatever, are now sharing a marital home, so that in the past when they've been on dates before being married, you know, which one would see the other one home and see them into their house and give them a kiss goodnight and then go off back to their own place, because don't forget this is Catholic Spain, so it's still slightly old-fashioned in some of its values. Whereas when you're married, no, when the taxi drops you off, you're both going to the same place. You're both going to share the same bed, you know. All this, and I just think some of those, you know, the book is looking at what you give up, what you surrender of the self, and what you pour into a partnership. What, you know, how much you lose of yourself, but how much you also willingly bring to the partnership and contribute to the partnership. And I just think it's just really, really well observed. So I gave it 4 stars because, as I say, I thought that the actual reveal of the reason behind, you know, the thing that started us was you know, a bit of a letdown, but it didn't matter because I was much more interested really in the ideas that were being bandied about. And on to Kurt Vonnegut's Timequake. This was his final novel, very much a Vonnegut shtick of very short, punchy, conversational, humorous observations that don't necessarily look like they're all linked, but some are, some aren't. Quite autobiographical. Having seen a 2-hour documentary, I recognise a lot of the stuff in here about his brother and his sister and his kids and the way his writing career went. So Timequake is a science fiction novel that Vonnegut had been struggling to make work for, I think, 10 years. And in the end, he sort of half scrapped it and made it into here, where it becomes a book about his inability to finish the book Timequake and all the autobiographical elements he brought into it. In a way, not hugely dissimilar in the things it's saying to Breakfast of Champions, which I've also read recently. I think Vonnegut, I mean, Slaughterhouse 5 is a modern classic. There's no getting away from that. It's a work of genius. But having read 3 or 4 of his other books, and 2 very recently, I just think he's a bit dated. Or no, not dated. Well, what he does, in a way, was probably quite radical in the 70s, but actually now looks sort of, you know, very mundane in this sort of postmodern style. I mean, I wouldn't call him a postmodernist, but that style of sort of seemingly unrelated little sort of gobbets and the sort of autofic stuff has been done, you know, is really de rigueur these days, it seems, especially the autofictional element of it. So I just think literature has sort of caught up and passed Vonnegut. So it's perfectly readable, perfectly serviceable, but it did have a sort of time capsule feel about it. 3 stars. Now, I have 2 more books to talk about. The Jewish Son by Daniel Guebel and Moving Kings by Joshua Cohen, both by Jewish writers. This from Latin America, from Argentina. This from the US. I'm going to talk about them individually and review them individually, but I'm then going to conclude this video with quite a long sort of discussion about my feelings about American Jewish authors, contemporary American Jewish authors. I'll put a timestamp when that begins, so that if you don't want to listen to that discussion, because it will make this video a lot longer than it would have been otherwise, that's totally fine. But I'm going to start with this, because this is not American, this is Argentinian. And really, a really pleasant surprise. I'm trying to think who I saw haul this. It was either Bob the Booker, I think it was possibly Eric, I think it was Eric Carl Anderson. Apologies to both those fine booktubers. I can't remember exactly who it was, but anyway. So the protagonist is probably the author, Daniel Guebel, in some version of him. And as a child, he had one sister, and he was totally rebellious. He was always getting into trouble. And he always was basically doing it to his mother because he wanted his mother to punish him. But she would always say those dread words, "Wait till your father comes home," which would enrage him and make him even more rebellious because, you know, dealing with the father was one thing, but he wanted her to take responsibility, to take action, to discipline him, to engage with him. But she always deferred it to the husband. And when he came home, sure enough, he punished him. And he also delivered his own sort of stock dread parental phrase, "This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you," as he gives him corporal punishment beatings. But it really did, because after the beating, he would hear his father go into the parental bedroom and sob. It is about fathers and sons. it draws quite heavily, or refers quite heavily, to Kafka's letter to my father, or letter to his father, which Kafka never sent to his father. He chickened out. I think he gave it to his mother to read, but we never found out, and she didn't pass it on to the father. We never found out kind of whether she gave it back to Kafka or what. And I do recommend reading that if you come by. It's a very, very wonderful statement of a son being rather intimidated by a father. So this refers to it a lot. You know, he's desperate for his father's approbation once he becomes an author, and he doesn't really get it. It's also God the Father, but for Guebel, God is the Father, or the Father is God in his life. He's not interested in religious God. He's interested in sort of entreating with the authority of his godlike Father, as his divine Father, who absents himself, who does not communicate, just like the religious God. And it's a lot about language. So, for example, he talks about how in the Jewish faith, like any sort of mono-atheism, there is an act of faith to the holy text, the holy writ, is verbatim from God. It's God's word, and therefore, inviolable and divine and must be obeyed, and all of that stuff. But what Judaism has, it also obviously has a sacred text, the Old Testament. The Christians have the New Testament, and Muslims have the Quran. So they all have their holy book, and all of those books have sort of scribes and sort of scholars, studying them and interpreting them and performing exegesis on them. But what he says is that Jews have an added level, that they are also allowed to use their own reason, outside of sort of religious dictates or textual dictates. If a law says thou shalt not eat pig, but if one's in a desert and starving and manages to capture a pig and you're on the point of dying, then you can eat pig, that kind of thing. So you can bring a sort of a non-religious logic to it. But further, there's the gematria in Judaism. Because the Jewish alphabet, each character has a numerical value as well as its syllabic, its lexeme, grapheme, whatever the individual character, the sound of it, but it also has a numerical value, and that you could do the maths, that the maths will prove a sort of ineffable proof of what the Word of God is saying. And that's the interesting stuff in itself, and it's stuff I know about. But how it's applied here is Guebel or the character is saying that Kafka in a way employed that. He didn't employ the numbers, but that sort of disputatious, that sort of relentless, remorseless questioning of everything on different levels was very much informed Kafka's writing, which I think is an interesting idea. So I just found this, I'd say, an absolute delight to read. It's only 100 pages, if that. It's a very quick read. 5 stars. Now, on to an antithesis, really, which is Joshua Cohen's Moving Kings. So I'd read Cohen's book, The Book of Numbers, which I pretty much really liked. It's slightly postmodern in that there's 2 characters called Joshua Cohen, not related. One is a version of the author, and the other is a tech guru. And the author has been asked to interview the tech guru for a long piece on the tech guru. And I enjoyed it, as I say. I haven't read anything else by Cohen, because the last time I sort of looked, I saw he'd written the book The Netanyahus, which had won, I think, the Pulitzer Prize. And I had actually no interest in reading it, because I have no desire to read about the sort of, uber-nationalistic, uber-Zionist sort of family that has delivered us Benjamin Netanyahu and all of that. But this was published previous to that. I've had it on my shelf for ages and ages and ages. Never got round to reading it. I picked it up, and I think it quite annoyed me. But in order for me to let me talk about the book first, and then I'll get to this larger discussion about sort of American Jewish authors. So it starts off with a guy, I think he's called David King. He owns or half owns a company that is responsible for moving people when they move homes and stuff. Obviously, at various times that can be quite grim because people have lost their houses in economic downswings and there are evictions. And he's not portrayed as a terribly sympathetic character. So this is a Jewish author writing an American Jewish New York Jewish character with fairly caricaturish elements, cartoonish elements, I felt. You know, he's always sort of skirting, you know, the wrong side of legality in terms of who owns what when, you know, you've kicked out the people from their house, what they haven't taken who or haven't had time to take, who owns it, you know, and if you sell it and make money, and all these sorts of things. So a reasonably unlikable character. He has a nephew in Israel who served in the army, and in this book, and I think there's probably something to it, a lot of Israelis, once they've done their time in the army, they want to get out of Israel for a year to sort of decompress and just, you know, come back into life really in a non-pressure cooker situation. So I think there's probably something to that. So this kid's mum asks her uncle or cousin, whatever he is, David King, can he get a job in New York, which itself is illegal because this kid doesn't have a green card. But anyway, he does. So then we get this guy trying to adjust to life in New York in a fairly menial job, but he's doing okay. And then his military buddy comes along, and actually a guy who was A, his superior officer, and B, who actually saved his life. And while the nephew is not really military material, he's a bit of a coward, self-confessed coward, this guy is all soldier, which begs the question, why does he need a year to decompress? But anyway, and then, you know, so you know, we left David King behind. Now we're looking through the lens of these two Israelis abroad in New York, and it drifts to its conclusion really. And I couldn't really see what the point of this book was at all. It's well written, it moves along, you know, fairly easy read, but, you know, as I say, it is well written. But I just didn't see the point of it. And the reason I say that is what I want to go on and talk about. So, in the aftermath of World War II, some of the biggest American literary giants were Jews. You had Joseph Heller, Philip Roth, J.D. Salinger, Saul Bellow, and these were guys who'd grown up, you know, and a couple of them had served in the Second World War, so they'd had the Holocaust. Obviously, you know, they were sort of protected from that by being American Jews as against European Jews. But previous to that, there was plenty of anti-Semitism in America. You know, Henry Ford, Walt Disney. What's the flyer called? Oh God, who's the famous flyer? Charles Lindbergh. All, you know, virulent anti-Semites. So the place of the American Jew was not a secure one, really. Obviously, they weren't as badly off as the place of Afro-Americans, but, you know, they didn't have it easy, as described in Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which is a brilliant book, and you should read that. The other thing, of course, is that time mutates, post-war mutates into the communist McCarthy trials, where communists are very much elided with Jews, that all Jews were communists in the eyes of McCarthyites, particularly in Hollywood, of course, where Hollywood being dominated by emigres from Europe who'd fled the Nazis, who were Jewish. So, you know, they're writing under pressure. The new generation, our current generation of Jews, seem to be the exact opposite. They seem to be complacent. They seem to be very established and secure and middle class and have dinner parties in New York. But that isn't really what my criticism is, because there are plenty of complacent writers. There are plenty of writers of privilege. So that in itself, you know, Jew and non-Jew alike, that in itself is not my criticism. My criticism is, and I'm talking about three specific books that I've read. I'm sure there are others. One is obviously this, Moving Kings by Joshua Cohen. Another is Here I Am by Jonathan Safran Foer. And the third, to a lesser extent, is 4321 by Paul Auster. All Jewish authors, all contemporary, although Auster is much older than Cohen and Saffron Fur. I would say that Auster is an example of the complacent privilege author, because 4321 is one of the smuggest, self-satisfied novels I've ever had the misfortune to read, and about 800 pages long. I can't believe that, I'd stuck with it. But what Cohen and Saffron Fur have done in the two books that I've mentioned is they have explored the relationship of the American Jew, particularly a New York Jew, with that of the Israeli Jew, and how different they are. And that's a perfectly legitimate subject to study, except I don't think anyone else is interested other than American Jews. I'm a British Jew, I'm not interested in it. I don't think South African Jews would be interested in it. It seems to be a peculiar obsession of American Jews, particularly New York Jews. And I think the reason for this is, again, historically, broadly, the Jewish intelligentsia of New York in the sort of 60s were on the left. And then along came Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics and things like the Intifada in the occupied territories and the Beirut hostages. And it seemed to me that the Jewish intelligentsia of New York shifted to the right, where they've been ever since, really. And that means that they became rabidly pro-Israel, pro-Netanyahu, and all of that type of thing. And that the authors decided they were going to explore the difference between American Jews and Israeli Jews as a way of, in a way, not really questioning what's going on in Israel. That's the surprising thing. In Moving Kings, we get these two Israelis over in America, and it's all about their experiences in America. It's nothing really about, what they left behind. And I think the absolute only significant thing in this book isn't even featured in the book. It's mentioned and then dropped, and that's that the military division that these two soldiers were in, I can't remember exactly what it's like, but it took its name from references in the Bible. And it's said in here that was done to inspire them, that they're fighting for their own land, and that's it. That's pretty much all this book says. But underneath that is a narrative that absolutely has to be challenged, and I want to talk about what that narrative is. So Passover is a Jewish festival, which Easter is pinned to in terms of the calendar. That's why Easter always moves around, because Passover moves around, because the Jewish calendar is a lunar one, whereas the Christian calendar is a solar one. That's why it's never the same time. Unlike Christmas, is on the 25th of December every year. And I know that's due to being a pagan festival, which the Christians usurp, but anyway. So there was one year where I happened to be listening to the radio in London, where the chief rabbi for the whole of the UK had been invited to give a pre-Passover speech, which he did. And I could not believe what was coming out of his mouth. He was talking about the boundaries of Israel, which of course are in dispute because of the whole situation of the occupied territories. And he was talking about how they were justified within the Old Testament. There are specific references sort of saying, Judea and Samaria. And actually the claim is that Jews have claims all the way up to Baghdad. That is where the true state of the Jews, according to biblical reference, should reside. And I was gobsmacked. And this is the absolute mantra of right-wing nationalistic Zionism. That it's in the Bible, therefore it is so. It is the word of God. It is the will of God. Therefore we the right-wing Jews will make it come to pass, and woe betide anyone who's in the way. And I feel that was at the heart of that casual reference to the fact that their division was named after specific references in the Bible to legitimise their land grab. I guess one of the points of this book is that, and it doesn't work, is that evicting people in New York from their houses because they can't pay the rent is somehow similar to pulling down the house of Palestinians because their son was a suicide bomber. It isn't. It's not on the same scale. It's asymmetrical. And also, that is a rather out-of-date version of what the Israeli troops do, because they expect there to be people on the other side of front doors and windows with guns. And so the Israeli army were doing things like coming up through the floors, digging tunnels and coming up through the floors of houses. Now, it's one thing coming up through digging tunnels under sort of, military defences, but this is people's houses. This is not, again, not the same thing at all. And I felt Cohen completely skirted over the implications of that. There's no real questioning, as there wasn't in Here I Am. So Here I Am by Saffron Fur was had an interesting premise that there's a major natural disaster which has knocked out all the power for the whole of the Middle East area. And because the Israelis are unable to wield their power without electricity and all the other things, that the Arab countries decide that they could take their chance and invade. And so there's a war going on. Now, I think that's a really interesting idea and worth exploring, but it's only used as the excuse to strand an Israeli character in America, I think in New York. And again, we get this whole thing of an Israeli Jew and an American Jew. And in a completely uninvolving way. I make no judgment on the sort of Israeli authors like, David Grossman lost a son in one of the military incursions by the Israeli army, so he has no love for the Israeli state. Amos Oz was always calling for a two-state solution. So this is no reflection on Israeli authors. This is about American Jewish authors of our contemporary times, who I think have nothing to say, because actually they want to throw a veil over the subject for whatever reason. I have written a short story, which I can't get published, and you'll probably be able to figure out why, where I have set it as a imaginary council of world Jewry, which they do happen from time to time, where they are discussing, the Americans have tabled an amendment that, due to Israel's moral bankruptcy towards the Palestinians, that the spiritual home for Judaism should be moved to America, which of course has a much larger Jewish population than anywhere else in the world. And so there are all the various delegates from different parts of the world, including European Jews, African Jews, American Jews, etc., are arguing over the back and forth over this debate. But, I can't find any Jewish publication that want to take that. So if you're a publication that might be interested in that, please contact me. But, I just, as I say, I don't believe any subject is worthy of writing about, of making a novel about. Absolutely. I would never deny them their right. I just don't think anyone's interested, either outside of America, in the particular subject of comparing American Jews with Israeli Jews. And I also don't think even American authors, because they're so smug and satisfied with their lives as Americans, they're not actually really interested in exploring it on any level at all. There's an assumption that, we will support Israel in all its repression and human rights abuses, because the state of Israel has a right to exist, and not have any scrutiny beneath that. So that's my feelings, that the American Jewish authors of the 40s, 50s, and 60s had so much more to say about the experience of being an American Jew than contemporary Jewish authors. And someone like here, Guebel, who of course is not part of that establishment because he's from Argentina and very much in a minority, he has far more interesting things to say about his experience of being an Argentinian and a Latin American Jew, I feel. So there you have it. Those are that's my recent reads and a little diatribe about American Jewish authors of the contemporary era. Till next time, thanks very much.